For 2 decades, she knew only chains and concrete. When freedom finally came, her reaction was so powerful that no one could hold back their tears. The scorching Arizona sun beat down on the small traveling circus at the outskirts of Flagstaff, where a tiny cub's eyes sparkled with curiosity at her new surroundings. Sierra, barely old enough to be separated from her mother, found herself in an unfamiliar world of canvas tents and strange noises. The circus owners watched her with calculating eyes, seeing not the vibrant soul within, but the potential profits her presence could bring to their struggling show. If you found this story interesting, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Tell us from which city you're watching us. Stay tuned. In those first days, Sierra's playful nature emerged despite her circumstances. She would paw at passing butterflies and chase her own tail, unaware that each sunset brought her closer to a life of confinement. The circus workers would gather around her enclosure, amused by her innocent antics, while the owners began planning her future role in their performances. The training sessions started gradually. At first, they seemed like games to Sierra, simple commands accompanied by treats. But as the weeks passed, the demands grew harsher and the treats became scarcer. The first time they brought out the chains, Sierra's eyes widened with confusion. The cold metal felt foreign against her fur, but she couldn't understand its significance. This was the beginning of a transformation that would reshape her entire existence. The small enclosure that initially seemed temporary became Sierra's permanent home. Each day, the space felt more confining as she grew, while her spirit began to shrink in equal measure. The concrete floor beneath her paws offered no comfort, no connection to the natural world she barely remembered. The chains, once strange and frightening, became a constant companion, their weight a reminder of her captivity. As months turned into years, Sierra's training intensified. The circus owners, driven by dwindling profits and mounting debts, pushed her harder each day. They knew that a performing big cat could draw crowds, and Sierra's natural grace, even in chains, made her a compelling attraction. But the price of entertainment was steep, and Sierra paid it with her freedom. The traveling circus moved from town to town across Arizona, setting up their tents in dusty lots and abandoned fields. Sierra's world became a blur of different landscapes viewed through the bars of her cage, all while the chains grew heavier and her meals grew smaller. The owners, focused solely on survival, saw no reason to provide more than the minimum necessary to keep their investment alive and performing. During performances, Sierra would go through her routines mechanically, each movement a practiced response to commands she had learned through repetition and fear. The audience would gasp and applaud, amazed by the sight of such a magnificent creature performing tricks, unaware of the spirit being crushed beneath the spectacle. After each show, she would return to her cramped cage, where the only comfort came from the familiar smell of sawdust and the distant sound of desert winds. As Sierra grew into adulthood, her once bright eyes began to dim. The curious cub who had arrived at the circus was fading away, replaced by a creature who knew nothing but the rhythm of performance and confinement. Her meals, always meager, became increasingly sporadic as the circus struggled to maintain its aging attractions. The owners, blind to everything but their bottom line, failed to notice or care about the declining health of their star performer. The circus's route became more erratic, their stops in each town growing shorter as they struggled to attract audiences. Sierra's world shrank further with each passing season, her existence confined to the space between her cage and the performance ring. The chains that bound her became more than physical restraints. They were shackles on her spirit, weighing down any remnant of her wild nature. Years passed, and Sierra's performances became a shadow of what they once were. Her movements, once fluid and powerful, grew sluggish and pained. The audiences thinned, but the owners pushed on, squeezing what profit they could from their diminishing attractions. Sierra's cage, never adequate to begin with, fell into disrepair along with the rest of the circus infrastructure. The only constants in Sierra's life were the cold concrete beneath her paws and the chains that never loosened their grip. Her daily routine became a blur of discomfort and resignation, each day indistinguishable from the last. The curious cub, who had once chased butterflies, existed only in the faintest of memories, replaced by a creature who had forgotten the meaning of hope. 2 decades had passed since Sierra first entered the circus, and time had etched its mark deeply into her being. The once vibrant cub had transformed into a shell of her former self, her magnificent form now bearing the visible scars of prolonged neglect. The small traveling circus on the outskirts of Flagstaff had become a testament to forgotten dreams and broken spirits, with Sierra's cage standing as its most poignant symbol. Each morning brought the same routine, the sound of rusted hinges creaking as workers delivered her meager portions of food, the scraping of chains against concrete as she shifted her weight, the distant murmur of an ever-dwindling audience. Sierra's movements had become mechanical, each step calculated to minimize the pain in her joints, worn down by years of performing on unforgiving surfaces. The circus itself had fallen into disrepair, much like its star attraction. The once colorful tents now hung in faded strips, their vibrant hues bleached by the relentless Arizona sun. The crowds that used to pack the stands had thinned to scattered groups, their applause growing fainter with each passing season. Yet the show continued, driven by the desperate determination of owners who refused to acknowledge the changing times. Sierra's enclosure, barely large enough when she was young, had become an impossible space for an adult. The concrete floor, worn smooth by years of pacing, told the story of countless circles walked in confinement. Her water bowl, often empty or filled with stagnant water, sat in the corner like a cruel reminder of basic needs barely met. The chains that bound her had left permanent marks on her limbs, the fur worn away to reveal skin calloused by metal. During performances, Sierra would go through her routines with a detachment that spoke of deep resignation. The fire that once burned in her eyes had dimmed to barely a flicker. Audiences would still gasp at her presence, but those who looked closely enough could see the truth. The mighty creature before them was but a shadow, moving through life like a puppet on strings made of steel and despair. The circus veterinarian's visits had become increasingly rare, replaced by quick glances and hastily administered treatments when absolutely necessary. Sierra's health had deteriorated steadily, though few noticed or cared. Her once glossy coat had become dull and patchy, her muscles weakened by inadequate nutrition and limited movement. The proud roar that had once echoed through the circus grounds had faded to a tired whisper. Behind the scenes, however, something was stirring. Unknown to the circus owners, their treatment of Sierra had not gone entirely unnoticed. Whispers began to circulate among the local community, passing from concerned citizen to activist groups. Photos taken by brave individuals made their way onto social media, showing the stark reality of Sierra's existence. The evidence was building, slowly but surely, like a wave gathering strength before it breaks. The circus owners, oblivious to the growing scrutiny, continued their pattern of negligence. They saw only what they wanted to see, a performing asset that still drew enough attention to justify its upkeep, however minimal. They failed to notice the increasing number of people who lingered after shows, taking photos not of the performance, but of the conditions behind the tent. Sierra's days blended into one another, an endless cycle of confinement and forced performance. The chains that bound her had become more than physical restraints. They were a manifestation of the spiritual bonds that held her captive. Even when not performing, she remained still, conserving what little energy she had. her gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the bars of her cage. The sounds of the circus, the calliope music, the announcer's practiced patter, the scattered applause, had become a hollow backdrop to Sierra's existence. She no longer reacted to the crack of the trainer's whip or the commands barked during performances. Her world had shrunk to the dimensions of her cage, her universe bounded by steel bars and concrete. Yet beneath the surface of this seemingly unchangeable reality, forces were gathering. The photographs and reports circulating about Sierra's condition were reaching individuals with the power to make a difference. While Sierra lay in her cage, unaware of the growing momentum for her freedom, a network of dedicated activists was preparing to challenge the system that had held her captive for so long. The first signs of change came quietly, like whispers in the wind. Animal rights activists had begun documenting Sierra's conditions with increasing frequency, their cameras capturing the stark reality of her existence from beyond the circus perimeter. Each image told a story of neglect, the inadequate shelter, the minimal food, the constant chains that bound her to her concrete prison. The investigation into Sierra's situation was a delicate operation, requiring patience and careful planning. Activists worked tirelessly behind the scenes, gathering evidence while avoiding detection by the circus owners. They photographed her enclosure from multiple angles, documented her daily routine, and recorded the duration of her confinement in chains. Each piece of evidence added weight to their case, building a compelling narrative of sustained mistreatment. Local wildlife authorities began receiving an increasing number of reports about Sierra's condition. The documentation was thorough. Detailed accounts of her physical state, her restricted movement, and the visible signs of neglect that marked her aging frame. These reports, combined with photographic evidence, started to paint a picture that was impossible to ignore. The circus owners remained oblivious to the growing scrutiny, their attention focused solely on maintaining their dwindling business. They continued their pattern of minimal care, unaware that each instance of neglect was being meticulously documented. Sierra's performances had become increasingly rare, her movements stiff and labored, yet she was still expected to appear before crowds when demanded. As the investigation progressed, a network of support began to form. Veterinary professionals reviewed the gathered evidence, providing expert testimony about the impact of Sierra's living conditions on her health. Wildlife specialists analyzed footage of her behavior, noting the signs of psychological trauma evident in her movements and responses. Each expert opinion strengthened the case for intervention. The turning point came when a comprehensive report was compiled, detailing 20 years of Sierra's captivity. The document included testimony from former circus employees who had witnessed the deterioration of her conditions over time. It contained medical assessments, behavioral analyses, and extensive photographic evidence of the inadequate facilities and physical restraints used to control her. Behind the scenes, plans were being carefully laid for Sierra's potential rescue. The Wildlife Rehabilitation Center of Arizona was quietly preparing a specialized facility, designed to accommodate an animal who had known nothing but captivity for most of her life. Their team of experts began developing a rehabilitation protocol, anticipating the complex challenges that would come with helping Sierra adjust to a life without chains. The investigation team worked methodically, ensuring every legal requirement was met. They knew that any misstep could jeopardize Sierra's chance at freedom. Each document was carefully reviewed, each piece of evidence meticulously verified. The goal was not just to remove Sierra from her current situation, but to ensure she would never return to such conditions. As the case built momentum, more organizations joined the effort. Environmental lawyers offered their services pro bono, helping to navigate the complex legal requirements for confiscating an exotic animal from private ownership. Wildlife experts contributed their knowledge, helping to build a comprehensive plan for Sierra's rehabilitation and long-term care. The circus's declining condition worked in the investigators' favor. The deteriorating facilities and obvious lack of resources made it increasingly difficult for the owners to justify their continued possession of Sierra. Health and safety violations began to accumulate, adding weight to the case for immediate intervention. Through it all, Sierra remained in her cage, unaware of the forces gathering to change her fate. Her days continued in their familiar pattern of confinement and deprivation, each moment marked by the constant presence of chains and concrete. Yet for the first time in 20 years, hope was building just beyond the borders of her small world. Hope in the form of dedicated individuals working tirelessly to secure her freedom. The day of Sierra's rescue arrived with the same dusty dawn that had greeted her for 20 years, but this morning was different. After months of careful planning and legal proceedings, the time had finally come. A team of specialized veterinarians, wildlife experts, and animal welfare officers assembled at the outskirts of Flagstaff, their vehicles forming a protective circle around the circus grounds. The operation was tense from the start. The rescue team moved with practiced precision, each member knowing their role in the carefully choreographed plan. The veterinarians carried their medical kits, prepared for any immediate health issues they might encounter. The wildlife handlers brought specialized transport equipment designed to move Sierra with minimal stress to her already fragile state. As the team approached Sierra's enclosure, the reality of her condition became even more apparent. The morning light revealed every detail of her degraded habitat, the rust-stained bars, the worn concrete floor, and the heavy chains that had been her constant companions. Sierra lay in her usual corner, her once powerful frame now diminished by years of inadequate care and confinement. The process of removing the chains was a delicate operation. Each link had left its mark on Sierra's body, creating calluses and worn patches in her fur. The veterinarians worked slowly, documenting each injury while providing immediate treatment where necessary. Sierra remained unusually still throughout the procedure, as if unable to comprehend that the weight she had carried for so long was finally being lifted. What struck the rescue team most was Sierra's reaction, or rather, her lack of one. When the last chain fell away, there was no dramatic response, no sudden movement toward freedom. Instead, Sierra remained motionless, her eyes fixed on some distant point, her body seemingly unable to process this sudden change in her circumstances. The team had expected resistance, perhaps even aggression, but Sierra's passive acceptance was somehow more heartbreaking. The specialized transport cage had been prepared with care, designed to provide security while minimizing stress. Fresh straw covered the floor, offering more comfort than Sierra had known in years. Yet when it came time to move her, she showed no interest in leaving her familiar confined space. The team had to use gentle encouragement and patience to guide her into the transport vehicle. During the journey to the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center of Arizona, Sierra remained eerily quiet. The veterinarians monitored her constantly, watching for signs of distress or medical emergencies. The roads leading to the center seemed to stretch endlessly, each mile taking Sierra further from her past, but also into an uncertain future. The rehabilitation center had prepared extensively for Sierra's arrival. A specially designed enclosure awaited her, featuring natural substrate, appropriate enrichment items, and most importantly, space. More space than Sierra had seen in 2 decades. The medical team had established a comprehensive treatment protocol, ready to address years of neglect and medical issues. When they finally arrived at the center, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the facility grounds. The team had hoped that Sierra would show some interest in her new surroundings, but she remained withdrawn. Her first steps into the rehabilitation enclosure were hesitant, almost reluctant. as if she couldn't quite believe in the absence of chains and concrete. The center's staff watched with mixed emotions as Sierra explored her new space with tiny, uncertain movements. Her behavior revealed the depth of her institutional trauma. She would only move within an area roughly the size of her former cage, despite having much more space available to her. It was as if invisible chains still held her. Boundaries existed only in her mind, but were no less real than the physical restraints she had worn for so long. That first night, Sierra chose to stay in the smallest corner of her new enclosure, pressing herself against the walls in a way that mimicked the confines of her circus cage. The rehabilitation team knew that this was just the beginning of a long journey. Freedom, they realized, wasn't just about removing physical chains. It was about healing wounds that ran far deeper than any eye could see. The first rays of sunlight at the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center of Arizona illuminated a scene of stillness. Sierra remained exactly where she had settled the night before, pressed against the corner of her new enclosure. The team of veterinarians, biologists, and animal behavior specialists gathered early, beginning their careful observation of their newest resident. Their expertise told them one thing: the real challenge was just beginning. The rehabilitation center's environment was a stark contrast to everything Sierra had known. Instead of concrete, natural substrate covered the ground. Rather than steel bars at every turn, carefully designed barriers provided both security and a more natural aesthetic. The space was filled with enrichment items, sturdy tree branches, natural scent markers, and even a small pool of fresh water. Yet Sierra seemed overwhelmed by these offerings, unable to process the sudden abundance of stimuli. During those first days, the medical team conducted their initial assessments with painstaking care. Every approach had to be calculated, every movement gentle and predictable. Sierra's physical condition told a story of long-term neglect. Her muscles were weak from disuse, her joints showed signs of chronic stress, and her coat bore the marks of poor nutrition. The team documented each finding meticulously, developing a comprehensive treatment plan that would address both her physical and psychological needs. What concerned the specialists most was Sierra's complete lack of interest in food. Even when presented with fresh meat, a far cry from the meager portions she had received at the circus, she would only glance at it briefly before turning away. The team was forced to place food closer and closer to her chosen corner, hoping to encourage even the smallest movement toward nourishment. The center's staff maintained constant observation, working in shifts to monitor every aspect of Sierra's behavior. They noted how she would freeze at unexpected sounds, how her eyes would track the movement of birds overhead with a mixture of fear and confusion, and how she seemed to struggle with the concept of space itself. The very freedom that they had fought so hard to give her appeared to be its own form of torment. A breakthrough came unexpectedly during the evening shift. One of the caretakers had left a radio playing soft music near Sierra's enclosure, a common practice used to help animals adjust to human presence. To everyone's surprise, Sierra's rigid posture seemed to relax slightly when certain melodies played. It was a tiny change, barely noticeable to an untrained eye, but to the rehabilitation team, it represented the first crack in the wall of Sierra's isolation. Building on this small success, the team began incorporating music into their daily routine. They observed how different styles affected Sierra's behavior, noting which sounds seemed to calm her and which caused her to retreat further into herself. It became a tool, a way to communicate when words and actions failed to reach her. Despite this progress, Sierra's recovery was far from linear. She continued to restrict herself to a small area, her movements calculated and hesitant. The team recognized these patterns as deeply ingrained survival mechanisms, behaviors that had helped her cope with decades of confinement, but now held her back from embracing her new freedom. The rehabilitation specialists worked tirelessly to create an environment that would encourage Sierra to expand her boundaries. They strategically placed food and enrichment items at gradually increasing distances from her comfort zone, creating a gentle pathway toward exploration. Each item was carefully chosen to stimulate natural behaviors that had been suppressed for so long. As days turned into weeks, the team documented every small victory and setback. They celebrated when Sierra took 2 steps beyond her usual territory to investigate a new scent, and they worried when sudden noises would send her retreating back to her corner. The process was painfully slow, but they understood that rushing Sierra's rehabilitation could undo what little progress they had made. Through it all, Sierra's eyes remained the window to her inner state. The dullness that had characterized them for so long occasionally flickered with something else, not quite interest, not quite awareness, but something that suggested she was still capable of change. The rehabilitation team held onto these moments, understanding that Sierra's journey toward recovery would be measured not in dramatic transformations, but in these tiny glimpses of her awakening spirit. As Sierra's rehabilitation continued with minimal progress, the team at the Wildlife Center knew they needed to try something different. Traditional methods had achieved little success, and Sierra's withdrawal from the world seemed to deepen with each passing day. It was during one of their daily consultations that someone suggested an unconventional approach, introducing Daisy, a specially trained golden retriever with a unique gift for working with traumatized animals. Daisy wasn't just any therapy dog. Her gentle demeanor and intuitive understanding of troubled animals had made her an invaluable asset to the rehabilitation center. She had worked with various species before, but Sierra would be her most challenging case yet. The team spent days preparing for this crucial introduction, knowing that the wrong approach could set Sierra's progress back significantly. The morning they chose to introduce Daisy was calm and quiet. The golden retriever entered Sierra's expanded territory with the same peaceful energy that had made her so successful in her role. There was no fanfare, no dramatic entrance, just the soft padding of paws on natural ground as Daisy made her way into the enclosure, maintaining a respectful distance from Sierra's corner. At first, Sierra showed no reaction to her new visitor. She remained in her usual position, pressed against the walls of her chosen space, her eyes fixed on some distant point. Daisy, however, seemed completely at ease. She settled herself on the ground, her body language relaxed and open, neither demanding attention nor avoiding it. The rehabilitation team watched anxiously from their observation points, documenting every subtle interaction. What happened over the next few hours surprised even the most experienced members of the team. While Sierra didn't move from her spot, her eyes began to track Daisy's movements. It was the first time she had shown sustained interest in another living being since her arrival at the center. The golden retriever's presence seemed to awaken something in Sierra, a curiosity that had been dormant for decades. Daisy's visits became a regular part of Sierra's rehabilitation routine. Each day, the dog would enter the enclosure and go about her business, rolling in the grass, playing with toys, and simply existing in the space without demands or expectations. Her natural joy in simple pleasures created a stark contrast to Sierra's rigid stillness, yet there was no judgment in her manner, no pressure for Sierra to change. The team noticed subtle shifts in Sierra's behavior during these visits. Her breathing would become more relaxed, her posture less defensive. Sometimes she would turn her head to follow Daisy's playful movements, her eyes showing a glimmer of interest that had been absent before. These were small changes, barely noticeable to an untrained observer, but to the rehabilitation team, they represented crucial steps forward. As days turned into weeks, Daisy's presence began to create a gentle rhythm in Sierra's world. The golden retriever's predictable visits provided a structure that was different from the harsh routines of the circus. This was a schedule built on comfort rather than control. Sierra began to anticipate these visits, her eyes moving to the entrance of her enclosure when Daisy's familiar paw steps approached. The breakthrough came on an ordinary afternoon. As Daisy performed her usual routine of peaceful activities, Sierra did something unprecedented. She took a single step toward the golden retriever. It was a tiny movement, hesitant and careful, but it represented the first time Sierra had voluntarily moved toward another living being since her rescue. The rehabilitation team held their breath, careful not to disrupt this delicate moment. Daisy's response to this momentous step was perfect in its simplicity. She continued her gentle play, neither retreating from nor approaching Sierra. This neutral acceptance seemed to give Sierra permission to exist in a new way, to explore the possibility of connection without pressure or expectation. The wall of isolation that had surrounded her for so long began to show its first real crack. The relationship between Sierra and Daisy became a cornerstone of the rehabilitation process. The golden retriever's consistent presence offered something that human caregivers couldn't, a model of peaceful existence untainted by the traumas of captivity. Through Daisy, Sierra began to see possibilities she had forgotten existed. Glimpses of a world where movement didn't lead to pain and interaction didn't mean performance. Just as Sierra was beginning to show signs of progress through her interactions with Daisy, fate had other plans. The rehabilitation team noticed something concerning during their morning health check. Sierra's right paw had developed an angry inflammation. What started as a small irritation quickly escalated into a serious infection, threatening to undo months of careful rehabilitation work. The veterinary team immediately recognized the gravity of the situation. The infection, likely exacerbated by years of walking on concrete and wearing chains, required immediate intervention. Daily treatments would be necessary, including regular injections of antibiotics, a procedure that would challenge the fragile trust they had built with Sierra over the past months. The first attempt to treat Sierra's infection revealed the depth of her trauma. As the veterinary team approached with their medical supplies, she retreated further into her corner than ever before, her eyes wide with a fear that seemed to erase all the progress she had made. Even Daisy's presence couldn't fully calm her during these moments, though the golden retriever tried her best to provide comfort from a respectful distance. The treatment protocol required daily handling, something Sierra had learned to associate with pain and control during her circus days. Each approach by the medical team triggered visible distress in her, making the necessary care increasingly difficult to administer. The staff tried various approaches, using food motivation and gentle encouragement, but Sierra's fear seemed to grow with each interaction. During one particularly challenging treatment session, disaster struck. In an attempt to avoid capture for her medication, Sierra backed away suddenly and collided with a metal support structure in her enclosure. The impact caused additional injury, complicating her already serious condition. The rehabilitation team watched in dismay as their worst fears materialized. Sierra's physical health was deteriorating, and with it, her emotional progress seemed to crumble. The situation became so severe that the veterinary team had to consider the possibility of surgical intervention. The thought of having to sedate Sierra and perform invasive procedures filled them with dread, knowing how such an experience might affect her psychologically. The specter of amputation loomed as a last resort, should the infection prove resistant to treatment. Through these difficult days, Daisy remained a constant presence, though Sierra had begun to withdraw even from her canine friend. The golden retriever would lie quietly at the edge of Sierra's space, offering silent support, even when Sierra seemed lost in her own world of pain and fear. The rehabilitation team noticed how Sierra's eyes would occasionally flicker toward Daisy, as if drawing some small comfort from her steady presence. The intensive treatment continued for weeks, each day a careful balance between necessary medical care and psychological support. The team worked in shifts, ensuring that someone was always monitoring Sierra's condition. They documented every change, every reaction, building a comprehensive picture of her response to treatment while searching for ways to minimize her stress. As the infection slowly began to respond to treatment, the team faced a new challenge. Sierra had retreated emotionally to a state reminiscent of her first days at the center. The trust they had carefully built, particularly through her relationship with Daisy, seemed to have been severely damaged by the necessary medical interventions. She avoided eye contact, refused most food offerings, and remained rigidly still in her corner. The rehabilitation specialists found themselves at a crossroads. The infection was finally showing signs of improvement, but the cost to Sierra's emotional well-being had been substantial. They had saved her paw, but in doing so, they had inadvertently reinforced her deepest fears about human interaction. Even Daisy's usually calming presence seemed to have lost its magic. Yet within this setback, the team refused to lose hope. They had witnessed Sierra's capacity for recovery, however small, in her previous interactions with Daisy. As her physical pain began to subside, they knew their next challenge would be rebuilding the bridges that fear and trauma had once again destroyed. The path forward would require even more patience, understanding, and creativity than before. As Sierra's physical wounds began to heal, the rehabilitation team faced their greatest challenge yet, helping her overcome the emotional trauma of her recent medical ordeal. The infection had left more than just physical scars. It had shattered the delicate foundation of trust they had worked so hard to build. Even Daisy's presence, once a source of comfort, now seemed to barely register with Sierra. The team knew they needed a new approach. Traditional rehabilitation methods had proven insufficient, and forcing interaction would only push Sierra further into herself. After careful consideration, they developed a strategy that would focus on rekindling Sierra's natural instincts rather than trying to rebuild human connections directly. The first step in their new plan involved modifying Sierra's environment. They began hiding small portions of food throughout her enclosure, carefully placing them in locations that would require her to engage with her surroundings. The goal wasn't just to feed her, but to awaken the natural foraging behaviors that had been suppressed for so long. At first, Sierra showed no interest in exploring for food. She remained in her corner, accepting only what was placed directly in front of her. The team persisted, varying the locations and types of food, always ensuring that the effort required to find it was minimal at first. Daisy, ever patient, would sometimes discover these hidden treats herself, demonstrating through her actions that exploration could be safe and rewarding. Days passed with little change until one morning something extraordinary happened. A small bird, unaware of the significance of the moment, landed near Sierra's enclosure. For the first time since her medical ordeal, Sierra's posture changed. Her eyes focused, her muscles tensed, and for a brief moment she displayed the instinctive behavior of a predator. Though she made no move to chase the bird, this flash of her natural self gave the team renewed hope. Building on this small sign of progress, the rehabilitation specialists began incorporating more natural stimuli into Sierra's environment. They introduced new scents, sounds of nature, and visual enrichment that might trigger her instinctive responses. Each addition was carefully calculated, designed to draw her out of her shell without overwhelming her recovering spirit. Daisy's role in this new phase of rehabilitation evolved as well. Instead of trying to directly engage with Sierra, the golden retriever began modeling natural behaviors, investigating scents, responding to sounds, and displaying curious but calm reactions to environmental changes. Her presence served as a living example that interaction with the world could be safe and rewarding. The team documented every slight change in Sierra's behavior, no matter how small. They noticed how she would track the movement of leaves in the wind, how her ears would prick at the sound of distant birds, and how her nose would occasionally twitch at new scents. These tiny responses, barely perceptible to casual observers, represented crucial steps in her recovery. Progress came in unexpected moments. During one afternoon, while Daisy was exploring the enclosure, Sierra shifted her position slightly to maintain visual contact with the dog. This small movement, the first voluntary repositioning they had seen in weeks, suggested that somewhere beneath her fear and trauma, Sierra's spirit remained unbroken. The rehabilitation team maintained their gentle approach, never pushing for more than Sierra was ready to give. They understood that recovery from trauma wasn't linear. Each step forward might be followed by 2 steps back, but even these retreats contained valuable lessons about Sierra's needs and capabilities. As weeks passed, Sierra began to show subtle signs of re-engaging with her environment. Her eyes tracked movement more consistently, her posture became slightly more relaxed, and occasionally she would stretch out from her corner to investigate something that caught her attention. These moments were brief and tentative, but they represented a crucial shift in her healing journey. The Arizona summer had been particularly harsh that year, with record-breaking temperatures and months without rain. The parched landscape surrounding the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center had become a tinderbox, waiting for a spark. When the first plumes of smoke appeared on the horizon, the staff knew they had to act quickly. A massive forest fire was approaching, and evacuation procedures needed to begin immediately. The rehabilitation center burst into organized chaos as staff members implemented their emergency protocols. Animals needed to be safely relocated, medical supplies secured, and facilities protected where possible. For the team working with Sierra, this crisis presented a uniquely challenging situation. Moving her would be difficult under the best circumstances. Doing so under emergency conditions seemed nearly impossible. The smoke grew thicker as the fire approached, casting an eerie orange glow across the sanctuary. The sound of emergency vehicles and helicopters filled the air, creating an atmosphere of urgency that seemed to affect all the animals in the facility. Even Daisy, usually calm and collected, showed signs of anxiety as she paced near Sierra's enclosure. Sierra's reaction to the growing chaos was concerning. The stress of the situation had caused her to retreat further into herself than she had been in weeks. The acrid smell of smoke, the unusual activity, and the general sense of panic in the air seemed to transport her back to her darkest days of captivity. Her eyes had taken on that vacant look the team had worked so hard to eliminate. As the evacuation order became more urgent, the team faced an impossible choice. They needed to move Sierra to safety, but any attempt to force her into a transport cage could undo months of rehabilitation work. The fire was advancing rapidly, and time was running out. The team knew they had to act, even if it meant risking the trust they had built. In the midst of preparations for Sierra's transport, something unexpected happened. She disappeared. During a moment of confusion and smoke-filled chaos, Sierra had slipped away from her enclosure. The team's hearts sank as they realized their worst fear had come true. Sierra was loose in an unfamiliar environment with a raging fire approaching and no way to track her location. The search began immediately, despite the deteriorating conditions. Teams spread out across the sanctuary grounds, calling for Sierra and searching every possible hiding place. Daisy, with her keen sense of smell, joined the search efforts, but the thick smoke made tracking difficult even for her. The minutes ticked by agonizingly slow as the fire drew ever closer. For 2 terrifying days, Sierra remained missing. The fire had been partially contained, but large sections of the surrounding area had been scorched. Search teams worked tirelessly, checking every hollow, every burned-out structure, every possible place where a frightened animal might seek refuge. The thought that Sierra might have been overcome by the smoke or flames weighed heavily on everyone's minds. It was Daisy, who finally led the team to Sierra's location. She had taken shelter beneath a fallen tree, surrounded by blackened earth and burned vegetation. She was injured but alive, her fur singed and her eyes wild with fear. The sight of her huddled there, having survived not through human help, but through her own instincts, struck the team with a profound realization about the resilience of life. Getting Sierra back to safety presented its own challenges. She was scared and hurt, making any approach difficult. The team worked slowly, cautiously, knowing that this moment could either strengthen or destroy the bond they had worked so hard to build. They noticed something different in Sierra's eyes as they approached, a glimmer of recognition, perhaps even trust, that hadn't been there before. The process of moving Sierra to a temporary facility was delicate and tense. Her injuries needed immediate attention, but the team was careful not to overwhelm her with medical procedures too quickly. They were acutely aware that this crisis could either break Sierra's spirit completely or somehow become a turning point in her journey toward healing. In the aftermath of the forest fire, Sierra was relocated to a temporary facility while the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center underwent repairs. The experience of survival had awakened something in her, a primitive instinct that decades of captivity had buried deep within. The team observed subtle but significant changes in her behavior that suggested a fundamental shift was taking place. The most noticeable change was in Sierra's response to her environment. Rather than retreating to a corner, as she had always done, she began to show interest in her surroundings. Her movements, though still cautious, carried a new purpose. She would pause to scent the air, her nostrils flaring as she processed the information carried on the breeze, a behavior the team had never witnessed before. Daisy's presence took on new significance during this period. The golden retriever, who had stood by Sierra through every challenge, seemed to sense the change in her friend. Their interactions, while still careful and measured, had evolved. Sierra would now actively watch Daisy's explorations of the temporary enclosure, her eyes tracking the dog's movements with what appeared to be genuine interest rather than mere observation. The rehabilitation team seized this opportunity to introduce new forms of enrichment. They created scenarios that would encourage Sierra to engage with her environment more actively. Simple puzzles containing food rewards were placed around her space, and natural elements like branches and leaves were introduced to stimulate her senses. To their amazement, Sierra began to investigate these items, albeit cautiously. One particularly memorable morning, the team arrived to find Sierra had moved all of her bedding materials to a different corner of her enclosure, the first time she had ever chosen to reorganize her space. This simple act of decisioning, of exercising control over her environment, represented a monumental step forward in her rehabilitation. It suggested that Sierra was finally beginning to understand that she had choices, that her actions could affect her surroundings. The medical team, monitoring her recovery from the minor injuries sustained during the fire, noticed another significant change. Sierra had become more cooperative during examinations, not through submission as before, but through what appeared to be a growing understanding that these interactions were meant to help her. She would still tense at times, but the vacant look that had characterized her responses to handling had been replaced by something more alert and present. Perhaps most telling was Sierra's reaction to the sounds of the reconstruction taking place at the main facility. Where once such noises would have sent her into a state of panic, she now seemed able to process them as non-threatening. She would listen, assess, and then return to whatever had occupied her attention before, a level of emotional regulation that had seemed impossible just months before. The team began to notice patterns in Sierra's daily routine that she had established for herself. She had preferred times for eating, for resting, for watching the activities beyond her enclosure. This self-directed scheduling was worlds away from the rigid, forced routines of her circus days. She was, for the first time, developing her own rhythm of life. Daisy continued to play a crucial role in this transformation. The golden retriever's consistent, gentle presence seemed to provide Sierra with a model for natural behavior. When Daisy would drink from the water pool, Sierra would often approach afterward to do the same. When Daisy showed interest in a new enrichment item, Sierra would eventually investigate it too. This pattern of learning through observation was providing Sierra with a bridge between her captive past and her emerging sense of autonomy. As weeks passed in the temporary facility, the team began to discuss Sierra's future. The fire had forced them to confront difficult questions about her long-term care and rehabilitation. While she had made remarkable progress, it was becoming clear that Sierra would never be a candidate for release into the wild. Her experiences had left her too deeply changed, her behaviors too fundamentally altered by decades of captivity. As the rehabilitation center neared completion of its repairs, Sierra's transformation continued to unfold in ways that amazed even the most experienced members of the team. The temporary facility, initially seen as a setback, had unexpectedly provided her with an environment where she felt secure enough to explore new aspects of her personality. Each day brought small revelations about who Sierra was becoming. The most remarkable change was in her interaction with the enrichment activities. Where once she would barely acknowledge new items in her space, she now approached them with cautious curiosity. The team had developed a series of food puzzles that required increasingly complex problem-solving skills, and Sierra had begun to show not just interest, but genuine engagement with these challenges. One morning, during a routine enrichment session, something extraordinary happened. The team had scattered small amounts of food throughout Sierra's enclosure, hidden under leaves and behind branches, a standard practice to encourage natural foraging behavior. Instead of waiting for the food to be directly presented to her, as she had done for so many years, Sierra actively began to search for it. Her movements, though still careful, showed purpose and intention. Daisy's role in Sierra's rehabilitation had evolved as well. The golden retriever was no longer just a calming presence, but had become something of a mentor, demonstrating natural behaviors that Sierra would gradually mirror. Their interactions had developed a rhythm all their own. Daisy would investigate something new, and Sierra would watch intently before making her own careful exploration. The team noticed that Sierra had begun to display preferences they had never seen before. She showed particular interest in certain scents, would choose specific spots for different times of day, and had even developed what appeared to be favorite enrichment items. These choices, however small they might seem to an outsider, represented a profound shift in Sierra's relationship with her environment. Perhaps the most significant change was in her response to the rehabilitation team members. The vacant stare that had been her trademark for so long had been replaced by something more engaged, a look of recognition, even anticipation, when familiar caregivers approached. She would still maintain her distance, but there was an awareness in her interactions that suggested she now saw humans as more than just sources of food or threat. During one particularly memorable afternoon, Sierra did something that brought tears to the eyes of her caregivers. As one of the team members was replacing her water, Sierra approached the bowl while the caregiver was still nearby, something she had never done before. She maintained a careful distance, but her body language was relaxed, showing none of the tension that had characterized her previous interactions with humans. The rehabilitation team began documenting these changes with renewed vigor, understanding that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Sierra's journey was becoming more than just a story of survival. It was evolving into a testament to the resilience of the spirit. Even after decades of confinement and trauma, she was discovering new ways to engage with the world around her. As Sierra's confidence grew, so did her vocalizations. The team began to hear soft sounds they had never heard from her before, not the defensive growls of her circus days, but gentler utterances that seemed to express curiosity or interest. These new vocalizations, though subtle, represented another layer of her emerging personality. The greatest testament to Sierra's progress came during a routine health check. Instead of requiring elaborate preparations and careful maneuvering, Sierra now allowed the veterinary team to approach her enclosure without showing signs of distress. While she still maintained her boundaries, her tolerance for their presence indicated a level of trust that had once seemed impossible. Through all these changes, one thing became increasingly clear to the rehabilitation team. Sierra was no longer just surviving, she was beginning to live. The chains that had bound her for so long were finally breaking, not just physically, but mentally as well. Yet with this progress came difficult questions about her future, questions that would require careful consideration and profound understanding of what freedom truly meant for a creature who had known so little of it. The rebuilt Wildlife Rehabilitation Center stood as a testament to resilience, much like Sierra herself. As the time approached for her return to the main facility, the team worked tirelessly to create an environment that would build upon the progress she had made. Her new enclosure was designed with every lesson they had learned about her preferences and needs in mind. Sierra's transfer back to the main facility was handled with meticulous care. Unlike her previous moves, which had been marked by fear and resistance, this time she showed remarkable composure. The team had prepared her for the transition using familiar scents and objects, and Daisy's presence provided the continuity she needed to feel secure. The new enclosure represented a significant upgrade from both her temporary housing and her original space. It featured various elevations, natural substrate, and carefully planned enrichment zones. The team had incorporated elements that Sierra had shown particular interest in during her time at the temporary facility. Certain textures, specific types of vegetation, and areas that provided both security and vantage points. What surprised everyone was Sierra's response to her new environment. Rather than retreating to a corner as she had done in the past, she began a careful exploration of her surroundings. Her movements were deliberate and purposeful, each step a conscious choice rather than a fearful reaction. She investigated different areas of the enclosure, paying particular attention to the spots where sunlight created warm patches on the ground. Daisy, ever the faithful companion, accompanied Sierra on these explorations. The golden retriever's presence seemed to provide a sense of security that allowed Sierra to push her boundaries further than before. Together they created a routine that combined rest, play, and exploration in a way that felt natural and unforced. The team noticed that Sierra had begun to display behaviors they had never seen from her before. She would stretch out in the sun, roll in patches of soft grass, and even engage in what appeared to be playful behavior with some of her enrichment items. These actions, so normal for most animals, were revolutionary for Sierra, signs that she was finally feeling comfortable enough to express natural behaviors. One particularly significant moment came when Sierra encountered rain in her new enclosure for the first time. Instead of seeking immediate shelter, she stood for a moment, feeling the droplets on her fur. The team watched in amazement as she tilted her head slightly, seeming to experience the sensation with curiosity rather than fear. It was a simple moment, but one that spoke volumes about her growing comfort with new experiences. The rehabilitation specialists continued to document every aspect of Sierra's progress, noting how she was developing distinct preferences and patterns. She had favorite spots for different times of day, preferred methods of receiving her enrichment items, and specific ways she liked to interact with Daisy. These individual choices and preferences were precious indicators of her emerging personality. Perhaps most telling was the change in her eyes. The dull, distant look that had characterized her gaze for so many years had been replaced by something more alert and engaged. When she watched the activities around her enclosure, there was a new awareness in her expression, a presence that suggested she was truly experiencing her surroundings rather than just enduring them. As Sierra settled into her new environment, the team began to see consistent patterns in her behavior that suggested a deeper healing was taking place. She would actively seek out interaction with certain enrichment items, show interest in new scents and sounds, and even demonstrate curiosity about activities beyond her enclosure. These behaviors, while still cautious, showed a level of engagement with her environment that had once seemed impossible. The question of Sierra's future remained complex, but it was becoming clearer that she had found something valuable in her new life. Not the wild freedom that nature had intended for her, but a different kind of liberty. It was the freedom to make choices, to express preferences, and to engage with her world on her own terms. As the seasons changed in Arizona, Sierra's transformation continued to amaze and inspire the rehabilitation team. Each day brought new signs that she was discovering aspects of herself that had been suppressed during her 2 decades of circus captivity. The team carefully documented every milestone, no matter how small, building a remarkable record of her journey toward healing. The most significant changes were visible in her daily routines. Gone was the mechanical response to feeding times and care procedures that had characterized her early days at the center. Instead, Sierra had developed her own rhythm, one that reflected genuine preferences rather than conditioned responses. She would choose when to rest in the sun, when to explore her enrichment items, and when to engage in quiet observation of her surroundings. Daisy's continued presence played a crucial role in this evolution. The golden retriever had become more than just a companion. She was a bridge between Sierra and the wider world. Through their interactions, Sierra seemed to be learning that connection didn't always mean control, that relationships could exist without chains or commands. Their bond had deepened into something that defied the team's expectations. One morning, during a routine enrichment session, Sierra did something that left the team speechless. When presented with a new puzzle feeder, instead of waiting for Daisy to demonstrate its use as she usually did, Sierra approached it directly. With careful, deliberate movements, she investigated the device, showing a level of independent interest that would have been unthinkable months before. It was a small moment, but one that spoke volumes about her growing confidence. The rehabilitation specialists noticed other subtle but significant changes in her behavior. Sierra had begun to show preferences for certain team members, not through fear or submission, but through what appeared to be genuine recognition. She would acknowledge their presence with alert ears and focused attention, a far cry from the vacant stare that had once been her default response to human interaction. The team had also started to observe moments of what could only be described as contentment. Sierra would sometimes lie in her favorite sunny spot, her body relaxed and her eyes half closed, displaying none of the tension that had marked her earlier days. These peaceful interludes, while brief, suggested that she was finally finding moments of true rest. Perhaps the most touching development was Sierra's response to the natural sounds around her enclosure. Bird calls, which had once caused her to retreat in fear, now drew her attention with what appeared to be curiosity. She would track the movement of small animals near her enclosure, not with predatory intent, but with a kind of peaceful interest that suggested she was finally feeling secure enough to engage with her environment. The rehabilitation team had begun to notice patterns in Sierra's vocalizations as well. The fearful sounds of her early days had been replaced by softer utterances that seemed to express everything from interest to contentment. These new vocalizations, while still rare, were worlds away from the stressed sounds they had first heard from her. Even Sierra's physical appearance had undergone a transformation. Her coat, once dull and patchy, had regained much of its luster. Her movements, while still careful, had lost the rigid quality that spoke of constant fear. She carried herself differently now, with a presence that suggested growing comfort in her own skin. The question of Sierra's future remained complex, but it was taking on new dimensions. While the team had long accepted that she could never be released into the wild, they were beginning to understand that freedom could take many forms. For Sierra, true freedom wasn't about vast spaces or complete independence. It was about having the choice to engage with her world on her own terms. Through careful observation and documentation, the team was building a deeper understanding of what rehabilitation meant for an animal like Sierra. Success couldn't be measured against the typical benchmarks of wildlife rehabilitation. Instead, it had to be evaluated through the lens of individual progress, each small choice made, each fear overcome, each moment of peaceful interaction with her environment. As the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center settled into its new rhythm, the team faced a profound decision regarding Sierra's future. The question that loomed over them was both complex and emotionally charged. What would true freedom mean for an animal who had spent most of her life in captivity? The team knew that Sierra's journey had reached a crucial crossroads. The reality of Sierra's situation was clear. She would never develop the skills necessary for survival in the wild. 20 years of captivity had left an indelible mark on her abilities and instincts. Yet, through her rehabilitation journey, she had discovered a different kind of freedom, one that existed within the safe boundaries of her carefully designed environment. This realization led to deep discussions among the rehabilitation specialists. They observed how Sierra had created her own territory within her enclosure, establishing preferred paths and favorite spots that she would visit throughout the day. She had developed routines that were entirely her own, not imposed by humans or dictated by fear. This autonomy, while different from wild freedom, represented a significant form of liberation for her. Daisy continued to play an essential role in Sierra's daily life. Their relationship had evolved into something remarkable, a cross-species friendship that defied conventional understanding. The golden retriever's presence seemed to provide Sierra with a sense of security that allowed her to explore new experiences with growing confidence. Together, they had created a social dynamic that enriched both their lives. The team noticed how Sierra's responses to various stimuli had transformed. Sounds that once triggered fear now sparked curiosity. Changes in her environment, which previously would have caused distress, were met with careful investigation. She had learned to trust that new experiences didn't always mean danger, a monumental shift in her worldview. One particularly significant development was Sierra's growing comfort with choice. When presented with different enrichment options, she would actively select what interested her most. She would choose when to engage with activities and when to rest, when to interact and when to maintain distance. These decisions, while seemingly simple, represented a profound change from her circus days where every aspect of her life had been controlled. The rehabilitation specialists had also noticed subtle changes in Sierra's interaction with the medical team. Regular health checks, once a source of tremendous stress, were now handled with remarkable composure. She seemed to understand that these interactions, while not always comfortable, were not threats to her well-being. This trust had been hard-won through months of patient, consistent care. Sierra's enclosure had become more than just a space. It was truly her home. She had marked it with her presence in countless small ways, from the paths she had worn in favorite walking routes to the spots she had chosen for different times of day. The team had continued to modify and enrich this environment based on her demonstrated preferences, creating a space that responded to her needs rather than imposing arbitrary restrictions. The question of Sierra's future began to answer itself through her own behaviors and choices. While she would never know the kind of freedom her wild counterparts experienced, she had found something equally valuable: the freedom to be herself, to make choices, to feel secure, and to engage with her world without fear. The rehabilitation team's focus shifted from what Sierra couldn't do to what she could. They celebrated her ability to find joy in simple pleasures: the warmth of the sun, the company of Daisy, the satisfaction of solving enrichment puzzles. They recognized that these moments of contentment, these choices freely made, represented a profound form of liberation for an animal who had known nothing but constraint for most of her life. The decision to make the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center Sierra's permanent home wasn't reached lightly, but it was made with the deep understanding that true freedom takes many forms. For Sierra, freedom had become less about physical space and more about the ability to exist without fear, to make choices, and to live with dignity. The team's focus shifted from rehabilitation toward creating a life that would continue to nurture her growing sense of self. Each day brought new evidence that Sierra had found her place in the world. Her movements through her enclosure had taken on a confident quality that spoke of comfort and security. She had established a daily routine that was entirely her own, choosing when to bask in the morning sun, when to engage with enrichment activities, and when to spend quiet moments with Daisy. These weren't the actions of a captive animal, but of one who had found peace within her circumstances. The rehabilitation team continued to modify and enhance Sierra's environment based on her demonstrated preferences. They noticed how she favored certain textures underfoot and created more areas with those materials. They observed which enrichment activities held her interest longest and developed new variations to keep her engaged. Every change was made with careful attention to her responses, ensuring that her space evolved to meet her needs. Daisy's presence remained a constant source of comfort and companionship. The golden retriever had an innate understanding of Sierra's moods and would adjust her behavior accordingly, sometimes providing active companionship, other times simply being a quiet presence nearby. Their relationship had become a model of genuine connection, one that required no chains or constraints to maintain. The team had also noticed a profound change in Sierra's relationship with her caregivers. While she maintained a respectful distance, there was a new quality to her interactions with the staff. She would acknowledge their presence with alert interest rather than fear, and would sometimes choose to approach the boundaries of her space when familiar faces appeared. These small gestures of trust were treasured by those who had witnessed her journey from the beginning. Sierra's physical appearance continued to reflect her internal transformation. Her coat had regained its healthy sheen, her eyes were bright and engaged, and her movements had lost the hesitancy that had marked her early days at the center. She had developed a presence that commanded respect, not through fear or showmanship as in her circus days, but through a quiet dignity that came from within. The rehabilitation specialists had begun documenting Sierra's story not just as a case study in animal rehabilitation, but as a testament to the resilience of the spirit. They observed how she had moved beyond mere survival to find moments of genuine joy, in the simple pleasure of a sunny day, in the satisfaction of mastering a new enrichment challenge, in the comfortable companionship of Daisy. Perhaps the most significant indicator of Sierra's transformation was the way she had begun to express herself. Her vocalizations, once limited to stress responses, now included gentle sounds of contentment. She had developed different ways of communicating with Daisy and her caregivers, showing a level of emotional expression that had seemed impossible during her early days at the center. The question of whether Sierra could ever be truly free had evolved into a deeper understanding of what freedom really meant. For her, freedom had become about having the space to be herself, to make choices, to feel secure, and to engage with her world on her own terms. It wasn't the freedom of vast wilderness, but it was a freedom that allowed her spirit to flourish in ways that her previous life never could. Life at the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center had settled into a peaceful rhythm that suited Sierra perfectly. Her daily routine, far removed from the harsh demands of her circus days, had become a testament to what rehabilitation truly meant. She hadn't found the kind of freedom that many might have expected, running wild across vast plains. But she had discovered something equally precious, the freedom to simply be. The rehabilitation team had come to understand that success wasn't always about dramatic transformations. Sometimes it was found in the quiet moments, Sierra choosing to rest in the sun, engaging with enrichment activities at her own pace, or sharing peaceful moments with Daisy. These simple pleasures, taken for granted by many, represented monumental victories for an animal who had known nothing but chains and commands for most of her life. Sierra's relationship with her environment had evolved into something beautiful to witness. She moved through her space with a quiet confidence that spoke of genuine comfort. The team had continued to refine and enhance her enclosure based on her preferences, creating a home that responded to her needs rather than confining them. Natural elements, carefully chosen enrichment activities, and comfortable resting spaces allowed her to express natural behaviors in ways that had been impossible during her circus years. Daisy remained an integral part of Sierra's world, their friendship having deepened into something that defied conventional understanding. The Golden Retriever's presence seemed to bring out the gentler aspects of Sierra's personality, and their interactions provided a daily reminder that meaningful connections didn't require force or control. Together, they had created their own language of companionship that enriched both their lives. The rehabilitation specialists continued to document Sierra's journey, understanding that her story carried important lessons about healing, adaptation, and the different forms that freedom could take. While she would never develop the skills necessary for life in the wild, she had found her own way to thrive within the protected environment of the center. Her story challenged traditional notions of rehabilitation success, suggesting that sometimes the best outcome wasn't about returning to what was lost, but about finding new ways to flourish. Sierra's presence at the center had become more than just a rehabilitation case. She was a living testament to resilience and adaptation. Her story spoke to the possibility of healing even after decades of trauma, of finding peace in unexpected places, and of the different shapes that freedom could take. The team had learned as much from her as they had taught her, gaining deeper insights into the complexity of rehabilitation and the many forms that recovery could take. As days turned into weeks and weeks into months, Sierra continued to show that healing wasn't a destination, but a journey. Each day brought small victories, a new behavior explored, a fear overcome, a moment of joy expressed. The team celebrated these achievements, understanding that they represented the true measure of rehabilitation success, not in returning to what was lost, but in finding new ways to thrive. Sierra never roared to celebrate her freedom, nor did she run wild across vast spaces, as many might have imagined. Instead, she found her peace in the quiet moments, in the warmth of the sun, in the companionship of Daisy, in the simple pleasure of making her own choices. Her journey had taught everyone involved that freedom wasn't just about physical space. It was about having the opportunity to exist without fear, to make choices, and to find joy in life's simple pleasures. Her story became a source of inspiration for all who knew it, a reminder that healing was possible even after the deepest trauma, and that freedom could take many forms. Sierra had found her place in the world, not in the wild spaces she could never inhabit, but in the carefully crafted environment where she could finally exist, without chains, without fear, and without the need to perform for others' entertainment. Dear viewers, we hope Sierra's journey of healing and transformation has touched your hearts as deeply as it has touched ours. This remarkable tale shows us that freedom can take many forms and that healing is possible even after decades of trauma. To continue experiencing more inspiring stories of resilience and hope, please subscribe to our channel and click the like button below. We bring you unique narratives every day that explore the complexity of life and the power of the spirit to overcome adversity. Join our growing community of storytellers and listeners by leaving your thoughts in the comments section. What does Sierra's story mean to you? What other stories of healing and transformation would you like to hear? Your voice matters in this journey we share together. Don't forget to click the notification bell to ensure you never miss our upcoming stories of courage, hope, and transformation.